what's coming.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started.
Sure.
Thank you for joining us for our no-till garden program here as part of our Come Grow With Us series at the West Central Research and Outreach Center. Today we are joined by Dr. Joe Storleen, who is an environmental studies professor at St. John's University. We have been delighted to have him as part of our program in the past and are so thrilled to have him here to talk about no-till gardening, because this is an area that we get quite a few questions about. And it's an area that Joe happens to know quite a bit about. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe. Oh, before I do, I'm going to just point out that we do have a chat section off to the side of the video there. So if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to leave for Joe, please drop your comment or question there, and then I will make sure that he gets it and can answer that either at some point during his talk or at the very end. We will address those. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Esther. I'm going to switch and share my screen now, and hopefully everybody can see what's going on. Let's see, start slideshow. There we go. So hopefully everybody can see the slide screen here, the first screen. Thank you very much. I got to say thank you to Esther and all the WC Rock folks for inviting me to share this information today, and especially thank you, for keeping this the Come Grow With Us series. I think it's more important than ever. Those of us in gardening really appreciate, certainly during pandemic times, the benefits of gardening, from food security to your own mental and physical health, how important gardening is to all of us in this day and age more than ever. And so thank you for continuing the outreach and the information and resources we're able to convey to everybody and share with everyone. And although I'm like many people, we missed Hort Night this year, but thank you very much for also the WC Rock folks for keeping the Hort display gardens open. They were so wonderful. I know myself, my wife and I took a trip over and were able to enjoy the tremendous displays they did, again with limited help. They had limited help this summer, and still it was an amazing display gardens again, as always. And it's just such a treat to walk through there. So thank you for all the work that you do. So to get into the talk today, talking about no-till, I've done, as Esther mentioned, I've done talks in the past about soil health, and that's kind of my background, as I'm a soil scientist. And in my soil health talks, I mentioned tillage and how it's detrimental to soil health, and how honestly we should be tilling a lot less, and how I am a no-till gardener. And so I always get questions about, well, how does that work? And so it's kind of how I developed this no-till garden talk, is thinking about where, people asking questions about how you do it. It's got a little finesse, just like everything in gardening. And so you can't just jump in and just kind of wing it. You kind of have a little bit of finesse to it. And so that's what I want to share with you. As far as an outline for the talk today, I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's good to practice no-till gardening. But really, I've done talks about soil health in the past, and we'll kind of refresh some of those concepts. And I've also got a really wonderful link to Dr. Anna Cates, who's our soil health specialist here in Minnesota, did a talk for the regional gatherings of the Master Gardeners this year for the state. And I've linked that at the end of some of my resources for people to check out. If you want to know just more nitty gritty on soil health stuff, she did a wonderful job this fall on putting together a soil health talk. And so that's a great one. Like I said, I'd rather spend more time on the how-to aspect, because I get a lot of questions on that. And so we'll go over the why, again, the importance of why to do it, but the how-to is really the kind of the meat and potatoes of my talk today. So to get into it, I want to just remind everybody that, we think about plants and having a healthy garden, healthy landscapes. A lot of it starts with a good foundation of a healthy soil. And really, people need to understand that plants and soil, work back and forth. They're a dynamic system, and really healthy plants will feed into a healthier soil, and a healthier soil will kind of feed into and create a healthier environment for plants. So they work off each other. They're kind of tied intimately for the most part. So when we're thinking about gardening, that's important to keep in mind. And certainly I always like to start off too with, when we talk about soil health, which is a term that'll come up quite a bit today, one of the reasons why we go for no-till gardening is to improve the health of our soil. And so what is soil health? We all should know that that's the continued capacity of a soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. So the big root words there, again, remember, it's functioning, it's doing something, it's active, and it's living. It's a living ecosystem. And that's really the big shift in the last 15 to 20 years or more from what we used to view in soil science versus soil health, and looking at soil health as a whole, is treating the soil now as a living thing. Because really only living things can have health. You don't have a healthy rock, you don't have a healthy chair compared to another chair. health is associated with living things. So that's really a big shift in mindsets of how we treat and manage soils in today's day and age when you talk about this term of soil health. So keeping that in mind, again, it's living things can have health. Well, it's important to remember that soil is practically alive. So soil is just teeming with life. So when you look out at a landscape or your garden and you see all the beautiful, plants and vegetation that are growing outside, just realize that that's actually small compared to, it's far more interesting, crazy things that in life teeming in the ground below it. Much of it is microscopic. So you're not going to see it with your naked eye, but there is so much more life actually going on below ground than what we see above ground most of the time. And a few of the fun facts that we always like to throw, talking about, putting this in perspective. When I say this life in the soil, it's invisible, but a teaspoon of healthy soil contains over 100 million to a billion bacteria. Just one kind of microbe is a bacteria. And you've got things like fungi and actinomycetes and protozoas and nematodes, and the list goes on. But and then another way you could look at it is just a cup of healthy soil contains 9 billion total microbes. Well, that's more people than there are on planet Earth. So there's more microbes in a cup of soil than there are people across the entire planet Earth, which is amazing. And on a per acre basis, scientists have estimated that this life, when you add it up, is about 5 tons of biomass per acre, which again, even though a lot of it's microscopic, it represents a tremendous amount of life. And then when you think about it, 5 tons of biomass per acre, that's a lot of food that you got to support a lot of living things to make a healthy soil. That's a lot of hungry critters and things to support. So that's what we get at when we talk about building soil health and supporting this biology. This is one of my favorite graphics. It's both kind of simplistic and really accurate at the same time. This is from Jerry Hatfield, and he talks always about the climb, the soil aggregation climb, and how we build soil health. You can't take a pill to take something and just get a silver bullet and feel better, feel healthy the next day for soil. This is like getting on the Stairmaster, and you got to work out, and you got to have a healthy environment, a healthy living system for this soil to eventually get to these visible outcomes and changes that you want to see for a healthy soil. A lot of the start, when you start doing these things we're going to talk about today, is going to be invisible. There's changes going on, but they're at the biological level, invisible, different dynamic processes related to the microbes and organic matter and nutrient cycling. But eventually, over time, you start to see more and more outcomes as you build a healthier soil. Things like improved soil structure or improved water availability that are going to result in greater, success of the vegetation and the plants. You're going to see real changes in what's above ground and visible things compared to those changes that are invisible sometimes when you start out. And we talk about soil health, climbing and getting healthy in the soil. We need basic necessities, and the microbes are very similar to us in needing basic needs. So, we need food. The microbes need food just like us, but their food is carbon or some sort of organic matter. They need water. Every living system, every living thing requires water just like us. They need air. A lot of these microbes that we're going to be talking about in the soil that are so important for soil health are heterotrophs. So they need oxygen. They breathe oxygen just like you and I do. And then they need shelter. So they don't like a lot of disturbance. And so that's where we're kind of going to get at with the tillage topic today. And when we talk about soil health principles, different organizations, when you talk about these principles, have different kind of pillars that stand up. And I know Dr. Cates, I think, shares 5. For simple garden purposes, for the average gardener, I just share a simple kind of 4 basic soil health principles that I kind of go by for this type of audience. And honestly, they're pretty basic. We just go down, we want to minimize disturbance of the soil. We want to maximize our soil cover, keep that soil covered, not a lot of exposure. We want to maximize biodiversity. And then we want to maximize as much as possible a continuous living root, so living things in that soil. Those are the kind of pillars of soil health that are going to bring us and work us towards that aggregation, that big climbing, that Stairmaster climb of getting healthier soil. And I was listening the other day, I had to think about this Field of Dreams, because I was listening to a radio program, a call-in garden show, and this gentleman had said that he thought his soil was dead and he wanted to do a biology test on his soil. He was telling the host, and that he was wondering what he could do to add the microbes. And a lot of the soil health principles, I always tell people, your microbes are there in different populations. And it's kind of if you remember back to Kevin Costner in the Field of Dreams, build it and they will come. same with the soil health. You build these soil health, a healthy soil environment, those microbes will come back. They'll be flourishing and very happy. You don't have to add some microbial thing to your soil to make it, healthier. You just got to create this environment for them, and they'll be there and they'll support you. So one of my favorite quotes from Jerry Hatfield, kind of a hero as far as agronomists and soil scientists, is he always says, you can't till your way to soil health. He's a big soil health proponent, and he talks about the relationship with tillage. And I like his quote, if you want a healthy soil, you're not going to get there no matter what type of, if you're doing a bunch of tillage. So I'm going to see if Esther can help me for a second. And I want to see what everybody that's out there listening today, why do you till? Why? What is the rationale? What do you hope to accomplish? What are we doing? Why do we till? And so I'll wait a few seconds and see a minute or so and see if Esther can chime in with some people, comments about why you think we need to till.
Yeah, I will definitely keep an eye on the chat here. I know there is a little bit of a delay, so we'll maybe just give it a minute or so and see what folks have to say. While we're waiting, I can share why we used to till, we don't anymore.
Okay.
Is because it makes it look nice. It's
Yes.
that instant gratification of you till it and the weeds are gone and it looks great and you just feel good about putting your seeds into the soil and it looks clean. Yeah, one comment is coming in. It says weed control.
Weed control, okay. Yep.
We got 2 votes for weed control.
All right.
Another one is to loosen the soil.
Compaction, loosening the soil, yep.
And preparing the seed bed.
Yep, those are all common, yep. So those all fall within the realm of what I typically expect. The loosening, the prepping the seed beds. You'd mentioned it looks, aesthetically pleasing. It looks nice, gets that seed bed ready, compaction alleviation. Some people mention always, getting rid of plant debris. They want to till it in, or they think they have to, if they add some compost or something, they have to till that into the soil. We get that notion as well that the plants aren't able to get it otherwise. So there's a lot of reasons why people till, or, my favorite response is always, well, we've always done it that way. That's just, the way we've always done it. I always think that one's pretty funny.
Yeah, there's been a couple more that just came in here. One is to work compost down into the soil.
Yep.
And the last one is to hold moisture.
Hold moisture. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a good one. Okay. Yeah, we could see that. So we're going to address quite a few of those, I think, when we go forward here. And, we always like to say in soil science, you look at a landscape out, near Morris, we have the beautiful, natural prairie ecosystems that are super biodiverse and lush with both, flowers and grasses intermingled with each other, beautiful lush landscape. Here in central Minnesota in the oak savannas, we got our lush landscape. You can go to the deciduous forest. Those are all natural systems Mother Nature has evolved with. And they've developed in a way where she doesn't, do tillage. Natural systems don't require tillage, and they still get these beautiful, lush, vegetation and landscapes. So how does, nature cope without this? And we like to laugh and say, that's an example of 3.8 billion years of research and development. She's figured out a system to make, this thing work. But on us humans, we like to think we can do better, right? We can improve on this some way. So what we might see, there's more natural ways of doing gardening, maybe with less tillage, that are still going to be beneficial to us. So certainly from a microbial standpoint, I like to share this, Jeff, every time, looking at, microbes. When you till the soil, this is what it's like for them. You take a microbe, you're destroying their life, their structure, their home that they built. You're just upending and flipping their house over, basically. It's very destructive. And certainly I also get questions from people that say, well, are we talking about never touching the soil? No, there's different degrees of tillage, right? Or different degrees of disturbance. And so I always use this analogy when likening, when I take my hori knife or my, trowel, and I just plug a hole in the ground to put a transplant in, cover it up. That's not super disturbing. That's not a big disturbance. That's, what EF0 tornado, if you're using that analogy, knocks the garbage cans over, maybe takes a couple of shingles off the house, but it's not going to do a lot of damage for the microbes. Now, on the other hand, if you practice more aggressive tillage, which the rototill systems that many gardeners use is certainly an aggressive form of tillage, working it sometimes multiple times a year, and doing it relatively deep, that's, you know, from a disturbance standpoint, that's the equivalent of like an EF5 tornado. That's the most powerful, you know, tornado. That's going to rip the house right off the foundation and obliterate everything in its landscape. That's really, really destructive. So there's different degrees of disturbance we can touch on. And then I have a lot of people that ask, like, well, what are you talking about? What happens like when you till? So to kind of visualize, I use these flow charts to kind of visualize, here's what happens kind of short-term and long-term to understand what's going on in the soil. So the first step when you till in, a lot of times you have some residues or things at the top that are tilled in. And had you left them there, you know, the microbes would only have the bottom up kind of point of surface area to attack on that landscape. So they wouldn't be able to attack as much surface area on that residue because they're coming from the soil and attacking it towards the top where it's sitting on the surface. But when you mix it in, now those microbes have, you know, 360 degrees of basically surface area to attack. They're much more efficient. And when I say attack, they're decomposing that material that you've added. The other thing is those microbes are also mostly heterotrophs. So they require oxygen, just like you and I, we're heterotrophs in the biology realm. We need oxygen to live, they need oxygen. So when you increase aeration, inject a lot of oxygen into the soil when you till it. So you give them food and you give them a bunch of air. And what you see is a huge burst of activity. They are living happy as clams. You know, they're just wonderful. They flourish, their activity goes way up. They're very efficient at decomposing whatever is in the soil around them now. And the other thing is when you till, you're taking these things called aggregates, which we're going to touch on in a little bit, these clods, these little clumps of soil, and you physically bust them apart. You're physically pounding these things and breaking these aggregates apart. And what that does is exposes older organic matter that was actually locked inside of that little structure. You bust it open and now you expose it for greater decomposition. So now they've got even more food to get at. So that's kind of the short-term immediate effects of when you till what's going on in the soil. Here's the longer-term downside is when those microbial populations spike, pretty soon they run out of food, the labile, what we call labile carbon, or the easy, the yummy food. And maybe an unpopular opinion, but let's say I use the analogy from Thanksgiving, which is coming up, and everybody has a favorite Thanksgiving food, and then you have lesser. For me, it's the green bean casserole is only okay, and that's probably, if people are in the physical audience here, you might be chucking things at me, but I'm not a big fan of the green bean casserole, so I'll eat a little bit, but it's kind of like me when I get through the turkey and the potatoes and the pie and the stuffing, all the good stuff. Then I got to clean my plate, and it's like, well, I guess I'll eat that, the green bean casserole or whatever, the thing that you don't like. That's kind of like the microbes. They run out of the good stuff, and then they're like, okay, I guess we'll start eating this older carbon that's not so yummy. And then as food becomes more scarce like that, and they're looking around, it's tough. Their microbial population, they're starting to starve, and they start eating this older carbon that really was quite yucky to them to start with, but they start kind of munching on that and getting rid of that older organic matter. And then their populations start to drop because they run out of food. And so the net result longer term for this whole tillage situation is a loss in overall organic matter. And that's a terrible thing because, and I've talked about soil health before, organic matter, if any students take my classes, they know is like the superhero of the soil. It accomplishes so many functions for us in soil and is so important to soil health. You don't want to lose your organic matter. It is so important. So, but unfortunately, the downside to tillage is you're going to lose organic matter slowly over time. As I mentioned, the other downsides here, we're breaking apart soil aggregates, which are important. We're going to touch on in a second. It destroys the structure. The ability for water and air to kind of get down into your soil, that aggregates are tied intimately to soil structure, and it destroys this. It disrupts the biology, and it promotes erosion. And I get people that mention, well, I garden on a flat, area. I don't really have a lot of erosion. And it's a great analogy out in just by Morris. In the wintertime, if you're driving around those tilled fields and you look in the ditch when there's snow, do you see the blackness and the dirt in the ditch? You might have a flat landscape, but we call that snert. So that's snow plus dirt in the landscape you see. And that's an example of wind erosion that's really common here in the upper Midwest in the wintertime where it's very dry and the soil near the top gets a little brittle, easy to erode in the winter. So when you expose that soil, it doesn't matter if you're on a flat landscape, all this promotes erosion. And then one of my things I really hate is it brings dormant weed seeds up to the top, and I'll be talking about that in a second. Just to touch on aggregates a little bit. Aggregates, again, reminder, these are these clumps in the soil. I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time talking about this because Dr. Anna Cates does in her YouTube talks. She does a really good, thorough job of this. But I want to, you can visualize those little clumps of soil. And if you zoom in really small and look at a kind of almost a microscopic level, what you're looking at is those clumps start with little, what we call micro aggregates. And that's just like silt and clay particles, the really fine particles in your soil that start getting stuck together by different microbial exudates and glues like glomalin. So they're just sticky microbial exudates, and they start sticking together, these silt and clay particles, until they form little clumps. And then those little clumps start forming bigger clumps, because then you have things like fungi that have these what are called hyphae, like spiderweb structures, that go out and probe around in the soil, and they kind of form around those little clumps almost like a net, and they can kind of surround them. And then plant roots do a similar thing. Some of the fine root hairs will actually go around those little clumps and form little, exploring for food and water and nutrients and things, and they almost net, and they create those bigger clumps. So those bigger clumps are created by all these different life processes basically in the soil. And aggregates are so important for your soil for so many reasons. They promote more infiltration of water and air, so getting air and water both down into the soil is what you want. After a rainstorm, you want the water to go in, not run off. And your plants in the root zone, they need some oxygen, so you got to have air in there. It aids in nutrient retention. These aggregates actually, believe it or not, resist compaction. They help your soil naturally resist compaction. The state tillage expert, Jody DeYoung-Hughes, always says that you think about them as for under tractor tires, they're like little springs. Your aggregates have a little bit of give to them. So they're actually something that resists compaction. And so many people till because they're trying to get rid of compaction. And here, if you break apart aggregates, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot from that perspective. They also reduce erosion because you got bigger particles that are harder to move, increases microbial activity, and overall enhances the soil health. So again, just a reminder that the #1 natural defense your soil system has against compaction are these aggregates, and they're really important. So you can kind of see them in my garlic that I've dug up in this photo. You can see those clumps in there. And just a reminder, tillage destroys that structure. It busts apart all those aggregates and makes it easier actually for the soil to compact again over time. The other one I want to touch on really quickly is just Arbuscular Mycorrhizae. So some of you have maybe heard of that term, some maybe not. This is a type of fungi, and this isn't, many gardeners have a negative connotation with fungi, but this is actually a great example of plants and of fungi, getting along in a symbiotic relationship. They actually help each other out. The plant will feed this fungi photosynthate, and this fungi will actually in return bring in more water and nutrients for the plant. So what it does, it actually literally infects plant root hairs, this fungus, and will forms a little physical barrier kind of around the root, and it will actually help it, like I said, bring in water and nutrients. And there's a little bit of Jody's, she shares, this information looking at studies with the mycorrhizae and without it. And you can go down the list and just see it's a big increase. When you have this symbiotic fungi associated with your plant that you're growing, those fungi have different enzymes and different tools basically that they can help increase the amount of nutrients that are soluble and brought into your plant. And this is just one example. There are numerous studies. I don't want to bore you, but there's numerous studies out there that show similar, nutrient uptake gains and things when you've got this symbiotic relationship. There are a myriad of benefits associated with Arbuscular Mycorrhizae in association with plants. Again, these two getting along, from enhanced water and nutrient uptake, reducing your irrigation needs, your fertilizer needs, increasing drought resistance. Also, there's a lot of studies that show your plants are more resistant to different pathogens, root pathogens especially, with more of this Arbuscular Mycorrhizae associations. And we know one thing about these. You can see this is a great visual of how it extends that root system down in the soil well beyond what your plant would normally grow. It's really, really effective and helps your plants out. And the downside is tillage definitely destroys those hyphal networks. When you come through and you till the soil, you're destroying them. And we also know from well-studied research papers that systems that have tillage in place have a much lower population of these Arbuscular Mycorrhizae fungi than systems that do no-till or less tillage. There's a lot of information and research on that. And then the last, kind of highlight that I want to talk about is just the weed seed aspect. So no-till benefits, there are numerous. Weed seeds, I hate weeding. And one of the things you do with these weed seeds, everybody's in their soil, you've got dormant weed seeds. And when you till the soil, you tend to bring several of them to the surface. Many of them were just waiting for light to germinate, and you've just given them light when you do that and air, and now they can germinate and flourish, and it's going to annoy you. And just a reminder to people that seeds can lay dormant for quite a while. So I've highlighted in our soils common seeds we probably deal with here in Minnesota, and I certainly deal with in my gardens. Dandelion can be dormant for 5 years. How about lamb's quarter? I think everybody probably deals with lamb's quarter that I know. Those seeds from lamb's quarter can lay dormant and viable in your soil for 4 decades or more. It's pretty tremendous. So again, you get a big flush of weeds after you till the soil. And that's something I really don't appreciate and I try to avoid. So hopefully at this point now in the presentation, I've kind of got you ready. I've convinced you a little bit. Again, there's more soil health information that I don't have time to cover in Dr. Cates's talk. Hopefully you check that out. But if you're ready to begin, I'm going to start kind of breaking down, and I respect that everybody's garden is different. Everybody's gardening situation is different. What you're growing is different. And so I want to touch on several different scenarios that you might be interested in no-till gardening. But everybody's come from different angles. So I'll kind of give a few different scenarios that you might fall into one of these categories that I'm talking about, and you can kind of align yourself with that mode. Certainly, if anybody's a raised bed gardener, really popular, I know in towns and things when we have limited size, or if you've got tough soil conditions, you've got a raised bed. This is going to be so easy for you because I'm guessing most of you in raised beds are not tilling all that much already. So just start following these no-till garden principles I talk about immediately, and you're well on your way. The other pretty easy one is if you've got some existing tilled beds, with not a lot of traffic, so there's not a lot of compaction issues. Again, getting started here is pretty easily. You just need to kind of stop tilling and start following the principles I'm going to outline in a second. And then if you're going from you've just got a lawn situation, you've got a brand new garden you want to start. This is kind of the journey I'm going to share with you. Some new work that I did this last year, looking at this, trying a brand new garden. And I'm going to open up another PowerPoint here. And we'll explore how to start basically from scratch. So completely from scratch. So I'm just going to share with you, I'm a very visual person, I'm a visual learner. I like seeing lots of images. So I'm going to share kind of a visual journey with some different approaches here and give you visuals on what this might look like or what this transition kind of steps would look like. So this is my property here. We bought our place in 2016 and it had a small, probably about a 15 by 30 garden area next to a shed. And this is kind of where I started. So it was a pretty rough situation. I guess you get a good challenge. I always like to say it's a good challenge. There are brambles as tall as I was. There's some Canada goldenrod in there, and you name it, reed canary grass, brome grass, quack grass, lamb's, you name the weeds, I probably had them in this garden here. And so that's where I was starting from, knowing full well that I'm going to have a tremendous weed seed bank, and so I'm going to be dealing with weeds for many years to come. That was kind of an impetus for wanting to do more no-till gardening, first of all, because I just knew the situation was not going to be good. From a weed perspective, and I don't like weeding, so I wanted to get rid of that. So phase one, I like to talk about, show some pictures. That first year is just kind of working on trying to smother some of what I had there with some cardboard, and then this is an aerial photo just of phase one. I kind of bumped it out by a 12 by 12. It's a bit of an L. It's only because the landscape tends to grade down. There's actually a rock retaining wall right here, and so that's why I didn't create a full rectangle, but just a small expansion to get started. And so this isn't a great photo. It's not the most aesthetic, but just showing you my initial time doing this. I wasn't ready to dive full blown no-till yet. So I did the existing bed tillage. I did till in everything one pass. I did till everything in to start. But then I started right away defining my beds and defining my walkways. And I used basically a double layer of newspaper down, covered that. I have access, I live near a mushroom farm, so I have access to lots of mushroom compost. And so I covered those beds with that newspaper then with this mushroom compost layer, and then planted transplants basically down into that and tilled no more after that point. And so this is a couple of years later. This was in 2019, I believe. So you can kind of see I've got these little wood chip kind of walkways. So I've got these walkways throughout the beds, and then I've got areas that are mulch that I plant into the beds themselves. But 2020, like several gardeners I talked to, was kind of the year where we're going to be at home a lot. I was home with my children actually this summer, knowing I'd be spending a lot more time around the home place and having 3 mouths to feed now and wanting to do a garden expansion for a while. I thought this is the year to do it. Better now than ever. And so I decided to jump in, and I wanted to put on this big kind of a 20 by 20 extension kind of onto what I had. So this is what I call the phase 2 aspect. And again, the reason I don't just make a rectangle is there's quite a bit of drop in elevation here, a bit of a slope. And I don't have heavy equipment to do any sort of soil moving. It's just me and a shovel. So I kind of limited how much of that slope I wanted to tackle at once here. So to get started, what I was doing, again, I have very heavy deer and rabbit pressure at my place. I back up to a kind of a natural wooded and wetland area to my south. And so I trench in a fence. I have a deer fence that goes up 7 feet, And then I have a poultry or kind of rabbit fence that gets trenched into the ground about 6 inches. So I had to trench the entire side all the way around the perimeter and put up that new fence. And then I also, you can see there's these plastic tarps down. So one of the things we want to do first, if you're starting from scratch, is we need to remove that existing vegetation. We need to kill that off. Especially very important in the no-till beds to kill off this existing vegetation. And so I was utilizing solarization techniques. So basically, you know, I get a little moisture on the ground below here in the spring on a very sunny, warm day, and I cover this with a clear plastic tarp so it heats up really hot underneath there, just like a greenhouse on a hot day. And it actually will burn and kill off that grass. So I use solarization as kind of a vegetation control technique. And then once the vegetation was kind of down, the next step is you just kind of smother the area. So I just simply used cardboard, and I covered this area for these no-till beds, just a single layer of cardboard across all this area. And then the beds themselves, you might notice there's a little, you know, there's cracks and little holes sometimes in the cardboard. So just to be sure weeds weren't going to come through, especially like quackgrass, which is persistent, I did a single layer of newspaper on top of that, right where the bed was, so I could kind of smother any of those weeds that found that little hole even more. And so you frame it out. You want to frame, if you're starting with a no-till bed, decide on a size, figure out where the bed is going to be and where a walkway, a predefined walkway is going to be. So I did that. These beds happen to be about 3.5 feet wide by 8 feet long. And then I typically use walkways that are, I find it convenient about 14 to 16 inch walkways. 12 inch I tried before, and it was a little too narrow. Get 1.5 feet, or, you know, you can also get excessive. So I just found that works for me. And then I've been reading a lot on different no-till resources. And one of the gardeners I really like is a guy named Charles Dowding out of the UK. And I really liked his book and his methods. And he's a proponent of just using compost. When you're ready to start your bed, he says you could just use compost. He does straight compost on top of this and plants directly into his compost. Now, as a soil scientist, I was a little leery. Last year in Minnesota, 2019 was our wettest year on record. And so I was a little hesitant to use just pure compost, worrying a little bit about the drainage situation. So I didn't opt for just the pure compost route. What I did, though, is just about one bag of a basic potting mix, basically a soilless kind of mix, one big bag, and used that blended 50% with a premium compost for the entire 3.5 foot by 8 foot bed. So it's not a lot of volume of material that I put in here for that. It's a bit of a raised bed, but it doesn't provide a ton of volume. It's just a little bit to kind of get started. Maybe at the peak there, it's about 4 to 5 inches high. And then, so that's basically my planting media that I'm kind of going to start with. And then I have, like I said, a lot of mushroom compost. Some of it's a little bit chunkier. So in case there was a lot of heavy rains, I kind of bordered my beds with some of this broken up mushroom compost to kind of hold the materials in. And then I just had those, some extra logs and things to define my beds and my walkways around. So that's kind of what I started with, and I wanted to try this. So this is a system, again, where I did not till at all. This was, in the past, I had done a tillage initially. This is, I want to try this absolutely no tillage whatsoever. So I planted directly on top of the soil. And the thought is by mid-season, that cardboard and newspaper are going to be almost decomposed. And the roots from those plants are going to begin to explore the native soil below there. And so that stuff will just decompose. And eventually your plant rooting zone will be much greater than that shallow little layer of media that I put on top. And you just need to give it time to get there. And so here's kind of a walkthrough. Here's June 4th. Again, not the most aesthetic thing. I was working by myself in the garden on the hours that I could put into it. So it's a little messy at times. Here's by June 20th, getting those plants. I'd finally finished potting. You can see in this one too, I like to put just like grass clippings down around. These are tomatoes. So I use tomatoes and peppers primarily in this trial beds this year. And then I use a darker substance. This is just a premium compost. I like to grow my peppers on a darker surface than the grass clippings are. So I typically get a little bit more temperature gain there by using just a dark compost on top. So if you're wondering what those beds are, this is that big expansion. Again, you can see I'm kind of working through. Here by the beginning of July, you can see the plants were doing really well. I was pretty pleased with the growth overall. One of the things I was concerned about, I have a wood chipper that I make my own wood chips, but it's time consuming, it's tedious. And so I don't always get them as much wood chips as I want all the time. And I was a little worried, would these plants get stressed at any point? Because I was just going to practice the same irrigation I do with the rest of my garden, a couple times a week if needed. And, I was worried about if the cardboard or the newspaper would wick any water out from below and kind of dry those beds out artificially. So I was a little cautious of that, but I got to say, by mid-July, and it was getting pretty, if you remember our summer, pretty warm by then, these things were growing fantastic. I was really happy with the results. And the differences in these tomato plants here, you can see these are just varietal differences. So this is a super tasty, this is a Comstock, and this is a Gardener's Delight. So they're just, the differences here is between a determinate and indeterminate tomatoes, nothing to do with the actual growing, media necessarily. But here's by, mid to late July at this point, again, really happy with the results. I did not see water stress. I didn't really have to worry about that cardboard or newspaper supposedly, wicking any water out. These things were growing great. Now remember, I never tilled this soil. This isn't a tremendous amount of volume of media they're growing in. And they were doing fantastic. So here's the mid July. And then I always like the fun jump, just jump a month ahead and watch those melons. Anybody that grows melons know they just take over. And so there's the melons by mid-August. And this is kind of just my final picture, just to share with you that, I was really happy overall this summer with this not tilling and just trialing this new method of just planting right on top of the soil. I had fantastic crop of peppers and tomatoes out of this method. And so I'm definitely a proponent of this method now moving forward. It certainly took a lot less effort. I didn't have to till anything. And so I was very happy with how that turned out. So the biggest things, again, if you're starting from scratch, the biggest things, remember to eliminate that existing vegetation that you might have. Smother that area. You got to smother it with some sort of newspaper, cardboard, whatever you have around to hold it kind of in place, and then mulch over the top. This method is really best done, they recommend, maybe a year in advance. So you could just put a whole bunch of mulch on top of that smothered area, wait a year, come back, and you can plant right into that. That cardboard will be gone, and it'll be a beautiful bed for you next year. I was a little impatient, so I was the one that wanted to mix some potting mix in and just go ahead and plant right on top to get started. But I had great results. So I can say that it worked for me. So some of my early, people jumped right away after some of my talks and say, well, do I have to sell my tiller or get rid of it, I guess, right away? And I say, not so fast. There's a couple exceptions, and there's some reasons you might want to till occasionally. A couple of them, I used to say the initial bed preparation, maybe, but now I'm saying probably it's not necessary based on my experiences this summer. But one of the things is if you're adjusting soil pH per se, if you've got a pH issue, like I know near my parents' place, they've got a pH out in the glacial till of Western Minnesota. It's closer to 8. And if you wanted to bring that down to kind of the ideal for vegetable gardens around 6.5 pH, you might want to add some elemental sulfur. And if you want to speed up the chemistry reaction of that happening, I could see blending in some of the granules of elemental sulfur into your beds. Inherently, that's going to be a slow process no matter what you choose, but I will say tilling will speed up the chemistry reactions of adjusting pH. The same with if you're a very acidic soil for some reason, if you're a 5 and you want to come up to closer to 6.5, you add agricultural lime, for example. And if you want to till that in, that's going to speed up the chemistry. So that might give you a jump on adjusting pH. The other one is a few people have drainage issues. If you've got a drainage issue that you can overcome and it's not unrealistic, I know some people start with, I've seen some good scenarios of using horticultural grit with organic matter like a compost to blend, tilling that in to kind of just improve initial drainage. That can help as well. Certainly, I remind people, don't just till in sand. Sand into clay is not a good recipe for success. Same thing with just like wood chips or something. That's a terrible idea. Please don't do that either. But so those are kind of a couple exceptions. Now, there's a few principles that we want to practice with no-till, and this gets into the finesse of doing it. One of the first ones I think some people overlook is we want to start preventing compaction. One of the reasons you probably have more compaction, the soils naturally compact a little bit over time, but many gardeners often are also walking and stepping in their beds or driving, the garden tractor or, something through their beds. So you're compacting the soil. What we do in these no-till systems is I create a permanent walkway around the bed. So I can access my beds from all different angles. I also create, for that reason, I create my beds no greater, I recommend, than 4 feet. I have pretty long arms, and 4 feet's even a stretch for me. I prefer mine about 3.5 feet wide, so that I can access and get to the middle of it, and I don't have to step into my beds anymore. I'm going to keep that area as uncompacted as possible. I even watch, some people, if you're working in the bed, you have a tendency to want to lean your arms into it. I watch, try not to do that. It happens sometimes, but I even try to watch what anything that I'm doing to just try to alleviate compaction, try not to compact it very much. And then those walkways, really recommend using some sort of permeable material that's going to discourage weeds from coming up. So I know many no-till gardeners like myself use wood chips. So I have wood chips that line mine. Lee Reich on the left, he uses wood chips. I use wood chips, but I also know people that have been successful if you've got access to like river rock or a little pea gravel or things like that. There's a good gardener, no-till gardener by Cold Spring here. She uses kind of rocks and pebbles. That works really good. That's also very functional. Or pavers, some permeable pavers with some, basically to get rid of excess water when it does rain, doesn't become muddy, but also prevents weeds from coming up. So that's one of the big things to start with. And this is just an example. You can see my walkways. And honestly, the wood chips are kind of nice to step on. They're cushiony. So it's nice to walk out through the garden, get access to those things. In the springtime, you can see my beds still are the darker, the surface there. I can still see the wood chips. I do top it off at least probably once a year. I add some more wood chips to the top because that does slowly decompose. The next big principle for no-till gardening is definitely thinking about mulching your beds. So I always like to laugh and say, yep, don't garden naked. So we want to keep that soil as covered as possible with some sort of mulch. Many of us no-till gardeners, our preference for a mulch is actually just compost. Your own compost is really black gold. If you're recycling your own, organic wastes in your landscape and making a compost pile, you've got some really valuable stuff right there. And that works as mulching material really well. So compost is a great option. There's lots of different commercial composts available. And I'm going to talk about other examples of things you could use in a second. And how much, I always get the question of how much. Really, you should guide your additions by a soil test. You should have a soil test, at least once every few years to see how your nutrients are doing in your soil and watch your pH and things like that. But I typically find that I apply about an inch to 2, depending on the bed and how long it's been in the no-till system for every year. And I do it typically, I like a fall addition. So after I clean out the beds in the fall, I typically do a little bit of a top dress. And that keeps the bed covered and mulched for the year too. So if we don't have snow cover and it's cold, I get less erosion that way. But you realize you have lots of options as mulch on top of your beds. Certainly I tend to go towards the organic stuff because it automatically feeds the bed. I have access to, mushroom compost is a great addition in many situations. I live near a mushroom farm, so it's easy to get. Many of us have leaves around the yard that you can turn into a mulch or a leaf mold. It's actually a really valuable product. I know some people just pile them off in the woods and then they never touch that spot again. Like I have neighbors that do that. But really, if you let that decompose for about a year and you dig in that pile, you see it's got, black composty, light, fluffy material. It's really good mulch material. Leaf mold is really valuable actually in the horticulture industry, especially oak leaf mold. That's a really good nutritious product as far as a mulch. You can even use it in some potting mixes and things like that, but leaf mold is a great one. A lot of people have access to that, so it's an easy one. Grass clippings work if you're not using herbicides, or certainly like me, if you're using flower beds, especially the wood chips work really good too to keep that soil covered. And what we're doing with covering the soil, it's important. We're creating a barrier for weeds. We're making it harder for weed seeds to germinate if there are any close to the surface. We've got great moisture retention by keeping the water that comes into your soil, keeping it there, preventing evaporation, and then regulating thermal big swings in cold to warm or hot conditions. We're going to regulate that. And I really like the organics because as they break down, any of these things I mentioned, they break down, then they're going to add nutrition back to the soil. It also another great way to decrease erosion, like I said, in the fall. Sometimes when we've got more bareness on our soil beds, I don't like the winter when the snow melts and then we get cold, windy days. You can blow a lot of soil around. So I keep it mulched in the fall for that reason. So we've got a nice cover. And all this is going to help increase soil tilth and aggregation. Now we get into some of the things, a couple other principles that really, I'm sure all of you gardeners are probably doing a lot of this already. Fall cleanup is really important in no-till systems. I'm pretty meticulous about picking up, plant debris because I'm not going to be working anything that would have fallen down a dead, and if it's got a little disease on it, I'm not going to be working into the soil to decompose it a little bit faster. So I want to be sure to clean off my beds pretty well. So cleanup's really important, especially to get rid of any sort of inoculum for pathogens for next year. So I was one of many gardeners I know across Minnesota that had anthracnose issues this year in my melons. Later in the year, I happened to lost some melons due to anthracnose. So all that debris has to get out of there. I don't want more inoculum for next year. I'm not going to be tilling in these beds to help decompose that material. So I get it out of the system. Much of the stuff that's pretty pathogen free just goes right into my compost pile. The bulk of the material goes in the compost. For the heavily diseased things that I don't want, maybe in the compost pile if it's not going to get hot enough, especially most of my tomato debris at the end of the year, I typically just have a bonfire and burn it up in a big bonfire. So the last one that I'm going to touch on for no-till principles is just water. This one is very straightforward. Anybody that's done a garden talk before knows the importance of good watering practice. Also, one of the principles for no-till systems, delivering the water right near the root base where the plant roots need it, where they're going to be extracting it. Avoid those overhead sprinkler systems, remembering that a good slow soak is going to yield a lot better infiltration for your water. And avoid watering the areas outside of that planting bed. So those lined walkways I have, I try to watch so I don't get a lot of water spillage on there, because I want to create kind of a harsh condition on those walkways. So if any weeds are coming or want to germinate down in there, windblown seeds, I'm going to make it kind of a harsh growing condition in those walkways. So I don't want to give water to those areas, just keep it in the beds only. And remember that water doesn't just flow straight down vertically. Because of capillary action, you don't need to water next to every plant. There's going to be some vertical movement, or excuse me, some horizontal movement of water through capillary action. So that's going to pull water around for you. And I should note at the bottom, the University of Minnesota did a great series called Water Wisely, just I think it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago now. Really good resource. It talks about all these principles really well. My dream I can share with you for the no-till system, the kind of the guru guy, one of the big book writers, Lee Reich, he has these fancy, if you've got these kind of engineered orifice emitters that compensate for your pressure gains, whether you're near the faucet or all the way at the end of the line, distributing a nice even amount of water the whole way. These are great systems. This is something I aspire to, I don't have yet, but it's on the wish list for the future. That's a great option. Now I get into this part about just sharing experiences that I think if you're going to do this, like I said, there's some finesse to it. And I want to touch on, I kind of get some frequently asked questions from people when you go no-till, some things that you maybe can't wrap your heads around right away or just need some tips with. One of them is talking about planting into these mulches. So there's good and the bad with this with no-till systems. I like to use a cover crop, especially after my garlic harvest. And I'll touch a little bit on cover crops later, but you could do a whole talk just on cover crops. So garlic comes out, if anybody grows garlic, in late July, early August, and then a little bit later, I add, put in that cover crop. And I like to use like a peas and oats mix, something that winter kills. You can use crimson clover is also popular one that I use. But basically, this is going to grow well into the fall. And honestly, it creates a beautiful organic mulch that you can plant right into the next year. So that's kind of what highlighted here. This bed in particular had a peas and oats cover crop. And then when I planted tomatoes into this bed this year, I didn't have to add that much mulch to cover the soil because I just had to pull apart some of that cover crop residue, plug my transplants down into there and cover it back up. And it was already like greatly mulched, a good mulch bed already situation. The other one I get people question about, well, how do you, if you're going to plant peas or carrots, especially, tough, tricky to germinate sometimes, or beans, how do you, when you're direct sowing, how do you plant into that mulch? You got so much mulch at the surface. It's pretty simple, actually. You just take, if you've got a heavy mulch, you certainly don't want to plug it right into the mulch. You just basically pull it to the side. So you can see in my bed, this is like a fall planted bush bean. So I just make a row where I'm planting into, where I've pulled the mulch aside, get direct soil contact with what I'm trying to grow, cover it up, let it grow for a little bit, gets so big, inch or two high where it's strong enough. And then I can just pull that mulch right back over around it. And then I've got the soil covered again. So it's just basically making an area for you're suitable to, germinate your seeds. If you're using a whole bed and you want to broadcast seed or something, I don't know, you could just rake off the mulch for temporarily and then get things growing, and then you can put the mulch right back on again. So there's ways around that. The other one that I know came up in like one of the regional gathering talks, and I know there's research on this. So some research indicates that no-till systems you can find lead to lower yield in cold climates like we have in Minnesota due to cooler soil temperatures, especially in the springtime. So if that can be true. So this has to do a lot with one of my favorite science words, albedo. So albedo is related to the light reflecting from more light colored surfaces reflect a lot more sunlight, dark colored surfaces absorb more sunlight. So you can imagine like corn stalks here in Minnesota come springtime, they have a fairly light color. So they tend to reflect a lot of solar light in the springtime. So if they're not tilled into the ground, the black exposed soil here in Minnesota has a much darker, a lower albedo. It doesn't reflect as much. And so it tends to warm up faster. So I found that, if you've got a light colored mulch and you're trying to warm that seed bed up in the springtime to plant something early, go ahead and move the mulch off a little bit for a few weeks and get that seed bed exposed to a little bit more soil for a little longer. Also, though, I think it's important. A lot of us use darker compost. So my compost is quite dark. And I've actually found that the beds where I'm just top dressing with a premium compost, it's already really dark in color. And I found the temperature in the soil, about 4 or 6 inches, is quite similar in the springtime than an area where I had exposed soil. So if you're using a darker mulch, you might not have this issue. And the other trick that I do in the spring is, remember I had those clear tarps that I used for solarization. You can use, if you've got those clear tarps, you can actually use those. What I actually just did this last spring, when I was planting my peas, it was still quite cold outside, but I wanted to artificially warm up my beds. So I actually had a couple beds where I took those clear plastic tarps and laid them over in the springtime. It's actually sped up the snow melting and then started heating up the soil faster. And I got about a 10-degree difference in warmer soil depth at about 4 inches or so in those tarped beds than I did in the non-tarp beds. So there's a myriad of tricks that you can use to kind of get around that issue related to, the research showing that it's a cold soil environment with no-till systems. So it depends on what you're using as a mulch, or you can kind of get around it with clear tarps. Another trick is with people had issues with slugs if you're not tilling, because it's well known you can decrease slug populations through tilling, and their life cycle kind of breaks some of that. I grew up with a situation where I didn't have a lot of slug issues in southwest Minnesota where I grew up. But now when I came to central Minnesota at my current property, yeah, I had a lot of slug issues. So I had to figure out a few things. And I found that not all mulches are created equal if you've got a slug problem. I found that things like straw and wood chips and the newspaper layers, those are pretty hospitable for if you want to promote slugs. They tend to crawl under those big materials, hide in a cool, damp area, and then come out at night. But I found that the regular premium, like a regular compost, a little bit less hospitable. I didn't have as much slug damage in those beds. And then I tried different things like the beer can traps or the diatomaceous earth. I tried different things. Honestly, I found the organic product iron phosphate, which is just an elemental fertilizer. It's just iron and phosphorus. That's an active ingredient in things like escargot, sluggo, different brands. That was pretty highly effective for me. That worked really well. And I also promote snakes and frogs and things that eat slugs in my garden. Some people don't like snakes. I understand that's fine, but they're part of the ecosystem that in my garden, and I welcome them into the garden. Frogs, snakes, birds, what have you. The second to last one actually is thinking about or managing some of the organic residues. So I know they also touched on the regional gatherings talks about some people concerned about maybe pathogens. Because we're not tilling the soil, would you get more diseases with a no-till system? And honestly, there's some research to that, but really it comes down to a couple of things that we're probably already doing. So one is, I mentioned before, fall cleanup is really important. We're gonna get rid of disease plant material. That's one. I think we're already doing that, many of us. The second one that we're probably already doing is we are good at crop rotation, right? We're rotating families of plants out of that same bed and getting new families in, which is going to help break disease cycles and pathogen cycles. So those two simple things actually right there, one of the concerns, some of the research had point to damping off as being an issue. Those two things that we're going to practice actually greatly negate concerns, especially with damping off. So I don't think you're going to see that as much. But mentioning organic residues, I will share a personal anecdote. I don't have research on this, but I found, because I got so excited about mushroom compost initially and I had great access to it, I tend to overuse it initially. I found it was very good for preventing weed seed germination, but it also had some germination inhibition properties for some of my like carrots and tender vegetables like that was direct sowing. So I still use mushroom compost, but I don't go as heavy. I blend it sometimes with other things, or I use it in certain scenarios knowing I'm not going to direct seed necessarily right into that. So that's just some personal tips. Cover crops, again, the regional gatherings, if you went to one of those, they talked a lot about this. Great for no-till systems. There are so many benefits. The biggest one I want to touch on, though, for especially Western Minnesota, where you've got more clay in your soil, is increased porosity. We want to get more porosity because we need to break up and open root channel infiltration channels for water and air. And so this is one thing that does. And I think the best visual for that, to see how that works, is if you plant a cover crop a year out, and then the next year you plant something in there, that cover crop is probably decomposed and left this big kind of void space in the soil, this root channels. That's a preferential path for whatever plant grows next. It's got an easy pathway down into the soil. And there's a lot of research shows plants prefer to go the easiest path. So that a lot of their roots will go find that same old root channel and follow that down into the soil and get a good rooting. So they're really good. Cover crops are wonderful for getting more porosity in the soil. And certainly if you've got a high clay soil and we're dealing with some compaction issues, try something like in agriculture, we use what's called tillage radish. It's actually a daikon radish. look at the size of the holes. These are big. If you've ever grown daikon radish, you know what they look like. But the holes they leave, that's tremendous porosity. You can really open up a soil, even a relatively fine textured soil, pretty well using what they call tillage radish. They call it tillage radish for a reason. So my final thoughts, just some basic takeaways for you at the end here. Thinking about, in Western Minnesota, I know I'm very familiar with your soil textures. Some of these soil textures are certainly going to be easier to implement this system on than others. I'm lucky I have a sandy loam soil. I know other people in Western Minnesota that have more sandy soils depending on where they live. Some of you have heavier clay soils, and I will say it is a little bit more challenging in those clay soils. You're going to have more patience. You're going to have more patience. It will pay off over time, but it's going to take a little bit more time. And if it's a really problematic soil, I don't know, why are you trying to garden in a clay soil anyway? You're probably better off just with a raised bed situation. You're going to be happier with the results. And this is not me telling everybody that you have to go do no-till. You don't have to even go all in. Just start small. At the very least, maybe practice less intensive tillage. Don't till as frequently as maybe you have in the past, especially if you're doing it multiple times a year. Or maybe just start small. Try it in a corner of your garden, or try, if you're going to do a new bed, one new bed, try this no-till thing. See how you like it. See how it goes. I think you're going to like the fact that you get less effort, a lot fewer weeds, and you're going to have really healthy plants and soil. And if you take away just 4 words, just remember my bottom line is add more and till less. And so the last resources, here's a list of resources for you. And again, I'll see if I can get these to Esther at some point at the end, maybe I don't know if we can post them somewhere, but we've got links to a great video by Dr. Anna Cates on soil health. People always ask me about good resources on this. My go-tos are, I really like the Weedless Gardening book by Lee Reich. That's wonderful. There's another great book you can check out. This is Charles Dowding. He's a UK guy. He's been doing no dig for a while. He also has a great YouTube channel. If anybody follows the Joel Gardner Show, he's got a podcast and the Growing a Greener World PBS series that have highlighted no-till gardening that are great to check out. If you want to see the Baptist preacher of no-till speakers, you got to check out Ray Archuleta. He's a big no-till guy. He's wonderful, very passionate person to listen to speak. He's got some great YouTube demonstrations as well. And if you're into more cover crops, which is kind of a complex type, you could spend a lot of time on that. The Midwest Cover Crop Council is a wonderful resource for cover crops. And with that, thank you very much. More on soil health, check out your Prairie Yard and Garden television, Pioneer Public TV. Did an episode on soil health. And I have an Instagram blog. You don't have to have Instagram to check it out, but I keep a little garden blog at Soil Centric Gardener on Instagram. So you can check that out. And here's my little garden helpers throughout the year and the many mouths that I feed throughout the year with my garden produce. So I will end it there. And Esther, if you want to, I can start fielding questions if you've got questions coming in.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Joe. I did place an ask on our chat that if you do have any questions or comments to drop them here. And we've got one that said, thank you, gave me some interesting information to consider.
Good.
Yeah, and if you wouldn't mind sending me that resource page with the links, I can make that available on the WC Rock website so that
Absolutely.
everyone can see it there. So I thank you so much, Joe. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Thank you to those who could join